There is a strange kind of regret that does not arrive when you fail. It arrives when you realize you could have begun. Not when the dream disappeared. Not when the opportunity was taken from you. But when you look backward and understand that the first step was available all along. You just kept moving it into tomorrow. Tomorrow, when you had more confidence. Tomorrow, when you had more money. Tomorrow, when you knew more. Tomorrow, when you felt less afraid. Tomorrow, when life finally became quiet enough for you to begin. And somehow, tomorrow kept moving. This is one of the quietest tragedies of being human. We rarely destroy our future in one dramatic decision. More often, we trade it away in small installments. One evening becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. Next month becomes another year. And because nothing terrible happens immediately, the decision feels harmless. That is what makes postponement so convincing. You can postpone a conversation without losing your relationship that night. You can postpone learning something without noticing what it costs you that week. You can postpone creating something without feeling the absence of what you never created. You can postpone changing your life and still wake up the next morning with the same room, the same phone, the same responsibilities, the same excuses. Nothing appears broken. And yet something is quietly being spent. Time. The most unusual currency you will ever possess, because you can spend it without ever seeing the balance. There is a version of your life that exists only if you begin. And there is another version that disappears quietly every time you decide that today is not the right day. But this is where the subject becomes more complicated. Because telling someone to start today sounds obvious. Almost insultingly obvious. Of course you should start today. If you want to write, write. If you want to learn, learn. If you want to build something, build. If you want to change direction, change direction. But human beings do not usually postpone important things because they have never heard that they should begin. They postpone them because beginning forces them to confront something uncomfortable. The possibility that they might not be as capable as they imagined. And sometimes, strangely, it feels safer to protect the fantasy than to test it. Because as long as the book remains unwritten, you can still imagine yourself as a writer. As long as the business remains an idea, you can still imagine yourself as an entrepreneur. As long as you never apply, never publish, never audition, never ask, never try, the dream remains untouched. Perfect. Potential. Unproven. And therefore impossible to disprove. That is the first hidden cost of waiting. You do not only postpone the result. You postpone the confrontation with reality. And reality, unlike imagination, gives you feedback. Sometimes that feedback hurts. You discover you are not very good yet. You discover the idea needs work. You discover that people do not respond the way you hoped. You discover that the path is more boring than you expected. You discover that the person you wanted to become is not going to appear simply because you imagined them long enough. But something else happens too. You begin learning. And learning is rarely as glamorous as imagining. It is slower. Messier. More embarrassing. But it is real. And perhaps that is what we are actually afraid of when we say we are not ready. Sometimes not ready means not prepared. But sometimes it means, I do not want evidence. Evidence that I might fail. Evidence that I might succeed and then have to take myself seriously. Evidence that I have wasted more time than I want to admit. Evidence that the problem was never the lack of opportunity. It was the fear of beginning. There is a subtle psychological comfort in keeping your life theoretical. You can say, I could do that. And those 4 words can protect an entire identity. I could start a channel. I could learn a language. I could leave. I could go back to school. I could write the book. I could become healthier. I could repair the relationship. I could build something of my own. I could. The word is powerful because it contains possibility without demanding evidence. But eventually, possibility has an expiration date. Not because dreams have an official deadline. But because every year changes the conditions under which the dream would have been pursued. The person who could have started at 20 is not the same person at 30. The responsibilities change. The relationships change. The body changes. The financial situation changes. The world changes. Sometimes the dream changes too. And that is important. Because start today does not mean that the exact dream you had years ago must still be pursued. Starting today might mean discovering that you no longer want the thing you once wanted. That matters. Because action does not only move you toward a destination. Sometimes action reveals that the destination was wrong. You cannot always think your way into certainty. Some questions only answer themselves after you move. You might spend 2 years asking whether you would enjoy painting. Or you could paint for 30 days and discover something no amount of thinking could have told you. You might spend months wondering whether you should start a business. Or you could sell something small and discover whether you actually enjoy solving problems for customers. You might spend years asking whether you should create content. Or you could make 10 imperfect videos and finally understand what you have been trying to understand from the outside. Action creates information. And this is one of the great misunderstandings about beginning. People often imagine that you start after you know what you are doing. But in many areas of life, you know what you are doing because you started. The first step is not the reward for having clarity. It is often the experiment that creates clarity. That changes the meaning of today. Today does not have to be the day you transform your entire life. It can simply be the day you collect your first piece of evidence. You write one page. You make one call. You save the first amount of money. You study for 30 minutes. You record the first video. You walk into the room. You ask the question. You send the message. Not because one small action magically changes everything. It doesn't. But because it changes your relationship with possibility. You stop being someone who says, maybe someday. You become someone who has begun. And identity is often built this way. Not through declarations. Through repeated evidence. You do something. Then you see yourself differently. Then you do it again. Eventually, the behavior stops feeling like an experiment and begins feeling like part of who you are. This is why the beginning matters more than its size. The first brick does not resemble a house. But the house cannot exist without the first brick. Still, there is another side to this idea. And it is a side that motivational culture often ignores. The obsession with starting can become its own form of avoidance. Because there are people who are always starting. A new plan every Monday. A new project every month. A new identity every season. They collect beginnings but rarely stay long enough to experience the middle. And the middle is where most meaningful things actually happen. The beginning is exciting because everything is possible. The middle is difficult because possibility becomes responsibility. At the beginning, you can imagine the finished version. In the middle, you have to deal with repetition. Boring practice. Unclear results. Mistakes. Periods where nobody notices. Periods where you question whether any of it is working. This is where starting today needs to be distinguished from constantly chasing a feeling. If you only begin when you feel inspired, you may become addicted to beginnings. You like the emotional freshness of a new plan. The notebook is clean. The schedule is perfect. The future looks beautiful. But eventually the novelty fades. And then you are left with the actual work. That is where intention becomes behavior. And behavior becomes habit. And habit becomes a life. There is a difference between wanting a new life and becoming willing to live the ordinary days required to create one. That distinction is enormous. Because most futures are not built during dramatic moments. They are built on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. When nobody is watching. When you do not feel particularly inspired. When the result is still invisible. When there is no applause. When you could easily convince yourself that missing one day does not matter. One day usually doesn't. But repeated days do. That is the strange mathematics of a life. A single choice can feel insignificant while thousands of similar choices become destiny. The problem is that human beings are not naturally good at feeling the future consequences of small decisions. We feel today. Tomorrow is abstract. The reward of watching another episode is immediate. The reward of learning a skill for 6 months is distant. The comfort of staying in bed is immediate. The confidence that comes from keeping a promise to yourself for a year is distant. The brain is not necessarily asking, which choice creates the better life? It is often asking something much smaller. What feels easier right now? And sometimes the easier choice is completely reasonable. Rest matters. Recovery matters. Leisure matters. Not every hour needs to be productive. This is where another distinction becomes important. Rest is not the same as avoidance. Waiting is not always procrastination. Sometimes you genuinely need time. Sometimes circumstances are wrong. Sometimes beginning immediately would be reckless. Sometimes patience is wisdom. But there is a difference between waiting because you are preparing and waiting because preparation has become a hiding place. You can research forever. You can plan forever. You can watch tutorials forever. You can buy equipment forever. You can organize the workspace forever. At some point, preparation stops preparing you. It starts protecting you. Protecting you from the discomfort of being a beginner. And beginners have to tolerate something adults often hate. Looking incompetent. A child learning to walk does not consider falling an identity crisis. They fall. They stand. They fall again. They do not sit on the floor thinking, Perhaps walking simply isn't for me. But adults have reputations. Adults have histories. Adults know how they want other people to see them. And that makes failure more expensive psychologically. If you are already known as intelligent, admitting that you do not understand something can feel threatening. If people know you as successful, starting something at which you are terrible can feel humiliating. If your identity depends on appearing capable, learning becomes difficult. Because learning requires temporary incompetence. This is one reason people sometimes prefer the fantasy of potential to the reality of practice. Potential looks impressive from a distance. Practice looks awkward up close. But practice is where potential becomes something else. Ability. And ability is usually less mysterious than we make it. It is often accumulated exposure. Repeated attempts. Corrections. Feedback. Time. You do not become good at something by proving that you are talented enough to deserve beginning. You become good partly because you were willing to be bad while beginning. That is uncomfortable. But it is liberating too. Because it means you are allowed to start badly. You are allowed to make the first version. The first video can be awkward. The first paragraph can be weak. The first business idea can fail. The first attempt at discipline can collapse. The first conversation can be clumsy. The first result can be disappointing. None of these things are necessarily evidence that you should stop. Sometimes they are simply evidence that you have entered the learning phase. And there is something deeply human about that. We want transformation without the period in which we are visibly transforming. We want the confidence before the experience that creates confidence. We want the body before the training. The audience before the work. The skill before the practice. The relationship before the vulnerability. The certainty before the decision. But life rarely works in that order. Sometimes courage is not what you feel before you act. It is what you discover you can tolerate after you act. And this brings us to comparison. Because one of the easiest ways to lose the ability to begin is to look at somebody else's middle while you are standing at your beginning. You see someone with 10 years of experience. You see the polished work. The audience. The money. The confidence. The house. The career. The body. The relationships. And then you look at your first attempt. Of course the comparison feels cruel. But the comparison is incomplete. You are comparing your first chapter to someone else's edited paragraph. And social media makes this even more confusing because the visible part of a person's life can be separated from the invisible years that produced it. You see the harvest. You do not see the seasons. You see the result. You do not see the repetition. You see the confidence. You do not see the uncertainty that came before it. And sometimes you see a carefully selected fraction of reality. This does not mean comparison is always useless. Comparison can teach you. It can reveal standards. It can show you what is possible. It can introduce you to ideas you would never have encountered alone. The problem is not seeing someone ahead of you. The problem is turning their existence into a verdict about your worth. There is a difference between saying, "They have built something I would like to learn from," and saying, "The fact that they have built it means I am behind in life." The first creates information. The second creates shame. And shame is a terrible long-term strategy. It can create movement for a while. But movement powered entirely by self-rejection becomes exhausting. You may begin because you hate where you are. You may work because you believe you are not enough. You may chase success because you believe achievement will finally make you acceptable. And perhaps you make progress. But then another problem appears. The finish line moves. Because if your worth depends on becoming better, there is always another version of yourself to criticize. This is where ambition and insecurity can become difficult to distinguish. They can look almost identical from the outside. Two people may work 12 hours a day. One is building something they genuinely value. The other is desperately trying to escape the feeling of being insignificant. The behavior looks the same. The internal experience is completely different. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. If nobody ever applauded this achievement, would you still want to pursue it? Not everything has to pass this test. Recognition is not inherently shallow. Humans need belonging. We care what others think because we evolved as social creatures. Being respected can matter. Being appreciated can matter. Providing for people can matter. But if the audience disappears and the desire disappears with it, perhaps you were not chasing the thing itself. Perhaps you were chasing what the thing seemed to say about you. And that is a very different pursuit. Because eventually, no amount of external achievement can permanently settle an internal argument about worth. You can win. And still feel behind. You can succeed. and still feel like an imposter. You can arrive somewhere you once dreamed about and immediately begin worrying about the next destination. This is why the phrase "one day you'll wish you had started today" contains a deeper question. Started what? Not merely a project. Not merely a career. What kind of relationship with your own life? Because perhaps the deepest regret is not that you failed to accomplish one particular goal. Perhaps it is that you spent too much of your life waiting for permission to participate in it. Waiting until you felt qualified to speak. Waiting until you felt attractive enough to be seen. Waiting until you had enough money to explore. Waiting until you were certain. Waiting until everyone approved. Waiting until fear disappeared. But fear is often not a signal that you should never begin. Sometimes it is simply the emotional cost of doing something that matters. The question is not, how do I eliminate fear before I start? It might be, how much fear am I willing to carry while I move? That is a more realistic form of courage. Not fearlessness. Capacity. You learn that you can feel uncertain and still act. You can feel embarrassed and still speak. You can feel inexperienced and still practice. You can feel rejected and still continue living. You can feel behind and still begin from where you actually are. This matters because waiting for the perfect emotional state can become an endless delay. You may never feel completely ready. And perhaps that is not a flaw in the system. Perhaps readiness is partly something you build through movement. There is an old philosophical problem hiding underneath all of this. We live only in the present, but we make decisions for a future self we cannot meet yet. The person you are today makes sacrifices for someone who does not exist yet. You study for the person you will be later. You save for the person you will become. You practice for a future version of yourself who can do what you cannot do today. But the future self is easy to neglect because they cannot complain. They cannot stand in front of you and say, "You promised me you would begin." They simply arrive. And when they arrive, they inherit whatever the present decided to leave behind. This is why time has such a strange relationship with responsibility. You practice for a future version of yourself who can do what you cannot do today. But the future self is easy to neglect because they cannot complain. They cannot stand in front of you and say, "You promised me you would begin." They simply arrive. And when they arrive, they inherit whatever the present decided to leave behind. This is why time has such a strange relationship with responsibility. Every day, you are making small decisions on behalf of someone you will eventually become. And that person will not experience your intentions. They will experience your consequences. They will not know how many times you almost started. They will only live with what you built, what you learned, what you repaired, what you left unresolved. That can sound frightening. But it can also be compassionate. Because your future self does not need you to become extraordinary overnight. They need you to stop abandoning them in small ways. Maybe that means beginning something. Maybe it means ending something. Maybe it means finally having the conversation. Maybe it means admitting that the goal you have been chasing is not yours anymore. Starting today is not always about adding more. Sometimes it is about removing what has been keeping you from living honestly. And this is where the idea becomes philosophical rather than motivational. A life is not simply the collection of things you achieve. It is also the collection of things you repeatedly choose. You become the person who waits. Or the person who experiments. You become the person who avoids difficult conversations. Or the person who has them. You become the person who needs certainty. Or the person who can move with incomplete information. These patterns accumulate. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like dust. You do not notice one day of avoidance. You notice 5 years later.